So it's my understanding that starting next Sunday, we are actually going to be shifting to a new series. And I'm not going to be teaching that. I think somebody named Joe is. I think Joe Roberts or Joe Wakeham. Is that true, Joe Wakeham? Yeah. They're going to be covering an 8-week series. Is that correct? To go along with David Young's sermon series. So the whole church is going to be doing that curriculum for starting next week for 8 weeks. So, as you know, I finished up the book of James last week, and I've got this 1-week period planning on doing James and Hebrews. So I figured I'd just go ahead and introduce the book of Hebrews today. And I know that when we come back in 9 weeks, everybody's going to remember everything I said about it, so we can just launch right in. I'll remember it all very well, too. Of course, I'll rehash a little bit of what I say today. Before we get into the introductory stuff, though, let me say this. I don't know, have you seen these kids' books called Would You Rather? You know, it's even a little contest that kids will have, Would You Rather? And depending on the age group and whether or not it's boys or girls, you get different kinds of questions, okay? So a lot of days I take my son Charlie and one of his neighbor friends to school. So you got an 11-year-old boy and a 10-year-old boy, and they like to play Would You Rather. And they can come up with the most disgusting stuff, all right? And I don't want to gross you out the things that they'll come up with, or the most painful stuff, you know, that kind of thing. But just to give you a flavor of the would you rather kind of thing, I looked up some questions that I haven't heard Charlie ask before. But would you rather eat a worm or lick a slug? Would you rather kiss a frog or a rat? Would you rather have 8 arms or 8 legs? Okay, this is kind of a ridiculous game that it is. And by way of introduction, I do think that the book of Hebrews could be summarized this way. Would you rather, all right, would you rather have Jesus or Moses? Okay, that's the way you would lay it out. Would you rather have Jesus or Moses? And obviously, everyone in attendance today is going to say Jesus. And the Hebrew writer is going to do the same thing, but the way he's obviously having to persuade some people who aren't sure. Okay? So, let's do all the important introductory stuff. A good reporter would cover the questions who, what, when, where, and why. So let's do that for the book of Hebrews this morning to serve as its introduction. I want to change the order up just a little bit, so we'll do who, when, where, what, and why. Okay? And we'll spend a lot of time on the who and a good bit of time on the what. And the rest of it will kind of all come together and hopefully form a good introduction to the book of Hebrews. So if you're a student of the Bible and you've done much study on Hebrews, then you probably know there is a lot of uncertainty about the authorship of Hebrews. So let's talk about who wrote the book and to whom was it written. In your King James Version, if you open it up, it actually answers this question for you because you'll notice it says the Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews. And that's nice that they answered that for us. Of course, the problem is we don't know that. It is certainly the case that for many centuries, most Christians just assumed that Paul wrote Hebrews. Therefore, it made sense to actually put his name to it. A couple of things worth noting. First of all, nowhere does the letter actually say Paul is the author. In fact, that's one of the things that makes you stop and say, wait just a second. In Paul's other letters, he starts off and says, Paul, an apostle, right? He introduces himself, but that doesn't happen here. In fact, you can see, this is the King James Version, but you can see it just starts off, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. We're not going to go through the King James Version for this, okay? This is one of those things, whenever I want to show people that the King James Version can be really hard to understand, not necessarily, I go to Hebrews 1 as one place because the language there is, well, it can be difficult for a 21st century reader. But the truth is we don't know that Paul wrote Hebrews, but what we can do is at least look at some evidence, okay? So first let's look at what Bible scholars will call internal evidence, and that means evidence within the letter itself, and then we'll look at external evidence by other circumstances and what other people have said. So it is true that there is, in the internal evidence of authorship, there are Pauline thoughts and phrases. I'm going to use that word Pauline. I'm not talking about a lady named Pauline. I'm talking about having to do with Paul, right? So these are Pauline thoughts. And you can see that throughout the book of Hebrews. And I got several examples here of places where Hebrews sounds a lot like what Paul writes. So for instance, chapter 1, verse 3 of Hebrews, the Son is the radiance of God's being and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word, which is very similar to Colossians 1, 15 to 17, that says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, for in him all things were created, and in him all things hold together. Those are major theological or Christological statements about who Jesus is, and they have a certain ring about them that seems like something Paul would write. Hebrews 2:4, God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. He's talking about the gospel. 1 Corinthians 12:11, all these work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. So I won't read all these to you, but I just want you to see that there is a lot of Pauline thought in the book of Hebrews. But that doesn't really settle it by itself for a couple of reasons. First of all, it'd be hard to say that everything in Hebrews could be found in Paul's other letters. And of course, if it could, maybe we wouldn't even need Hebrews. But also, there's a lot in there that doesn't sound like Paul. And especially in his language. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So continuing to consider internal evidence, a couple of other things worth considering. The Greek of Hebrews is more sophisticated than any of Paul's other writings. And if you've done a study of Greek, then you'll know that the New Testament written in Koine Greek, so the Greek of the street, okay, of the common person, it's not like the Greek of ancient Athens, okay? It's the everyman's Greek. It's the language of the street that people could understand, normal people used. But still, even within that, just like in English, some people have a loftier and more commanding vocabulary and use of the language. It's certainly true in Greek as well. And so if you talk to Greek scholars, they'll tell you that Hebrews is the loftiest, best written Greek in all of the New Testament. It's written more like classical Greek. And it's certainly the case that when you read Luke's writings, his is more eloquent than, say, Mark's, for instance. In fact, oftentimes if you're going to ask Greek scholars, what's the worst Greek of the New Testament, they'll say that Mark's is. Mark almost certainly didn't speak Greek as a first language. And so he's writing as someone who learned Greek, later in life, probably. So the point being here is that in Paul's other writings, while there is certainly evidence of great learning, it's also clear that Greek wasn't necessarily his most comfortable language. And let me say this, it's not just modern Greek scholars who point this out. Ancient Greek speakers said the same thing, and I'll even show you evidence of that, okay? People who spoke Koine Greek every day, they noticed, wait, this doesn't sound like Paul, this Greek is too good for Paul, okay? That's not just a modern skeptical biblical scholars' point. There are a couple of other things within the book that we could hang our hat on too about internal evidence. In Hebrews 2:3, the author says, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. Was confirmed to us by those who heard him. So this puts it as someone who has heard an apostle speak, right? Some translations say was confirmed to us who heard him. So the idea is that the author is claiming to be an ear witness, to have heard Jesus speak. So if that's the way we're supposed to translate it, then what he's saying is, I met Jesus and heard him preach. Paul couldn't say that, right? What's that? He could about the Damascus Road. Right, so, by those, but to us, indicates that we're talking about a group of people who would have heard Jesus speak, right? So it's not that Paul didn't have a revelation of Jesus and didn't somehow speak to Jesus after the resurrection, but this seems to be referring to people who heard Jesus in his earthly ministry, okay? But, again, the way the NIV translates it leaves open the idea that someone like Paul could have heard someone who was an ear witness to Jesus in his ministry. The other is Hebrews 13:23. I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released. If he arrives soon, I will come with him to see you. A couple of things. This is the only place, as far as I know, in the New Testament that we find out that Timothy was also arrested. But secondly, it's clear that not only does the author know Timothy, but that they travel together, right? So that kind of leans towards the Paul camp a little bit, doesn't it? It sounds like something Paul might say. Well, it's hard just from what's in the letter itself to make a definitive argument. So now let's look at what some early church writers and early church documents had to say. First of all, and I should have separated these out better, in favor of Pauline authorship. So if you're going to argue that Paul is the author of Hebrews, there are a few things that you want to point out. First of all, one of the oldest manuscripts that we have, New Testament manuscripts, is Papyrus 46, dated somewhere from 175 to 225 AD. And it includes the book of Hebrews. It's just a collection of Paul's writings, and the book of Hebrews is in it. Okay, and I'll even show you a picture of P46 in just a moment, or at least the Hebrews 1 portion of it. The early Christian writer Clement of Alexandria, and remember that word Alexandria, we'll come back to that in a minute, wrote this. Clement is a Greek-speaking Christian writer of the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and he says, Hebrews is the work of Paul, and I cut off the first part of the sentence. There are those who say Hebrews is the work of Paul and that it was written to the Hebrews in the Hebrew language, but that Luke translated it carefully and published it for the Greeks. And hence the same style of expression is found in this epistle and the Acts. But he says that the words, Paul the apostle, were probably not prefixed because in sending it to the Hebrews who were prejudiced and suspicious of him, he wisely did not wish to repel them at the very beginning by giving his name. Now let me, I made that too difficult to understand. So Eusebius is a church historian, and he's writing about, in his church history, he writes about a lot of things that happened in the first few centuries of Christianity. And one thing he says is that Clement said about the book of Hebrews that it's the work of Paul, but that Paul didn't want to, he didn't want to get credit for it, and so he left his name off of it. But he says this, he notices that the Greek isn't Paul's Greek. It's more like Luke's if it's anybody's, and so he says, Paul wrote it in the Hebrew language, but Luke translated it. Okay? So what we have is a translation of Paul's original Hebrew. Now, Clement, as far as we know, is the only one who said that, and most Greek scholars will say, nah, that's not the way Hebrews reads. There's a difference in the way you read, the way a translated document sounds, and the way that something that's originally written in a language. So probably not, but anyway, just worth noting that Clement, who was pretty close to the time of the apostles, had a tradition that Paul wrote it, but that it wasn't the version that we have now. Origen, who a little later in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, he said Paul wrote it, and I wrote that, this word is kinda. He kinda said it. And what I mean by that is that Origen, on the one hand, in his writings, when he would refer to Hebrews, sometimes he would say where the apostle wrote this, or Paul says this in Hebrews. And so it seems that he's indicating he thought Paul wrote it. But you're going to see a quotation from Origen in just a moment that he wasn't nearly so sure. Okay? So at least for practical purposes, he would refer to Paul as the author of Hebrews. By the way, you might hear preachers do that sometimes, right? Who would say, Paul says in the letter to the Hebrews this and that, but then if you went up to him afterward and said, hey, are you sure Paul wrote Hebrews? You might be like, I don't know. But it's our tradition, and it's fine, and it certainly doesn't harm anything if we think Paul wrote it. But Origen, so he probably did that kind of thing. And then Eusebius, who is the historian I was talking about earlier, and I just noticed something. I've got the guy living 180 years, which would have been real impressive. Okay, that should say 260 to 340 AD. All right. Boy, he would have lived a lot of church history if he lived that long. So Eusebius, he'll quote earlier writings, and thankfully he does that because most of them we don't have anymore, okay? So he's quoting them. Then he's also telling you what's going on in his time and that kind of stuff. And so even when I'm quoting someone like Origen, a lot of times I'm actually quoting Eusebius who's quoting Origen. And what Eusebius says is that the Church of Rome accepts the book of Hebrews, but not that it's written by Paul. Okay? So they think it's Scripture, they just don't think Paul wrote it. And this is a kind of a pattern that seems to develop in the early church. And that is, in the Roman Empire, of course, you've got the Western Latin-speaking part of the empire, and you've got the Eastern part of the empire, which in the New Testament times is all just one empire, but later divisions are already obvious even in early days. So it wasn't until the 4th century that Rome officially broke its empire into two, to an official Eastern and Western empire, with Constantinople as the Eastern capital. I think I have that on Constantinople set up by Constantine as the Eastern capital, and of course Rome being the Western capital. But this division works historically and it works linguistically. So you've got the Latin-speaking West and you've got the Greek-speaking East, and that pretty much holds up. Of course, historically, after what we consider the Roman Empire falls, it doesn't really fall because it exists for many, many more centuries, but people often refer to it as the Byzantine Empire. But it's just the Eastern Roman Empire where they called themselves Romans, but they spoke Greek, not Latin. So the Roman Empire had two languages, Latin and Greek. And in the Greek-speaking part of the church, it seems that it was kind of assumed Paul wrote Hebrews, but in the Latin-speaking West, they were less likely to say that. So now let's look at evidence. Again, this is external evidence, so apart from Scripture, against Pauline authorship. So Tertullian, who is from the West, he says that Barnabas wrote Hebrews. He's, I think, the only one to suggest that, but for some reason he thought that Barnabas wrote it. Eusebius mentions Gaius of Rome, notice Rome, which is in the West, that he also said that Paul did not write Hebrews. He just happens to mention that. And then Origen mentions that some think Clement of Rome or Luke wrote Hebrews. Okay, so now you see Luke's name come up again, right? But instead of saying Luke is Paul's translator, now you're just saying that Luke wrote it. And then Clement of Rome is interesting. So we've already mentioned Clement of Alexandria, who was much later than Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome was a first century leader in the church, in the Roman church. So in the Church of Rome, and some would call him Pope Clement. But it is clear that he was a very important early figure in the church in Rome. And we have some of his writings, and we know they're dated at the latest around 100 AD. And so in one of those letters we call First Clement, he uses a lot of language that is very similar to the book of Hebrews. Okay, I'm going to give you just one example, but there are lots of places you could look. And it's helpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps us date the book of Hebrews. And we'll say more about that in a minute. But second of all, you could see why maybe someone would say, this seems like something Clement might have written because of the shared ideas. So not reading all of Hebrews 1, 3 through 13, but just hitting some of the highlights, and then reading 1 Clement 36, I just want to show you some of the similarities. Speaking of Jesus, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. To which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? And of the angels he says, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire? But to the Son he says, your throne, O God, is forever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. But to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? Clement says, again, not exact same language, but similar language, who being the brightness of his majesty is so much greater than angels, as he hath inherited a more excellent name. For so it is written, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. But of his Son the Master has said this, you are my Son, and this day I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the Gentiles for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. And again he says unto him, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. So you see, a lot of similarities, quoting same passages, talking about angels and that kind of thing. Now, I think at the most basic level, what this really shows is that Clement had read Hebrews. That's the most likely explanation. That's what most Bible scholars say, which indicates Hebrews had to be written before Clement wrote his letter. But it also could be said that, hey, there are lots of places where Clement shares some of the same thoughts that Hebrews says. So, and there was at least some tradition that Origen mentions. Let me show you. I know this is a long quote. I do read a lot of text to you, and I apologize, but I want you to see what Origen said. Remember I said he kind of accepted Pauline authorship? But now you got to read this part. That the verbal style of the epistle entitled to the Hebrews is not rude like the language of the apostle, who acknowledged himself rude in speech. That is an expression. But that its diction is pure Greek. Anyone who has the power to discern differences of phraseology will acknowledge. Now, Origen's a Greek speaker. That's his first language. He's trained in it. He knows this isn't the kind of Greek Paul uses. Okay, so that's what he's saying. Moreover, that the thoughts of the epistle are admirable and not inferior to the acknowledged apostolic writings, anyone who carefully examines the apostolic text will admit. If I gave my opinion, I should say that the thoughts are those of the apostle, so Paul. But the diction and phraseology are those of someone who remembered the apostolic teachings and wrote down at his leisure what had been said by his teacher. Therefore, if any church holds that the epistle is by Paul, let it be commended for this. For not without reason have the ancients handed it down as Paul's. I love this. But who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows. He said, God knows, I don't. All right? The statement of some who have gone before us is that Clement, bishop of the Romans, wrote the epistle, and others that Luke, the author of the gospel and the Acts, wrote it. But let this suffice on these matters. And I should probably do that too, to let this suffice on these matters. I could have made it a lot easier if I just said, we don't know for sure. It might have been Paul, it might not have been. Okay? But I wanted you to see at least some of the discussion that's to take place to give you some background. Now, let's talk about recipients for just a minute. Most assume that Hebrews is written for Jewish Christians tempted to return to what I call the mainstream Jewish community. But it's also the case that it could be written to Gentile Christians who are fascinated with Judaism. Now, I told you about Papyrus 46 or P46, which is a collection of Paul's writings from the late 2nd, early 3rd century. So this is the part with Hebrews, the beginning of Hebrews, and it has right here, to the Hebrews. So that's important because it tells us that very early on, not just that people accepted this as Scripture, but that they thought it was written to Hebrew people, or to Hebrew-speaking people, or to Hebrew-thinking people. Okay? The tradition is very early that this has something to do with Hebrew. It's not written in Hebrew, though. It's written to Hebrews, and so you're thinking Jews, right? Or Jewish matters, that kind of thing. Now, we don't think that the to the Hebrews part was originally part of the letter. It was just a heading added, as was true of the other writings in the New Testament. So it's probably the case that to the Hebrews was attached to it after it was written, but for good reason, because it's obviously written to people who have Jewish sensibilities. So if we go just with the first category, then the way we would understand Hebrews is that there are Jewish Christians. So these are Jews who didn't take up a new religion. They instead accepted the promise of the Scriptures that God would send the Messiah, and He did, and His name is Jesus of Nazareth. So they've accepted Jesus as Messiah. They're now worshiping Him. They're now being discipled in the faith to learn about Jesus and to be part of the church. But there's great temptation to be part of the greater Jewish community that rejects Jesus. And specifically, the Jewish community that is persecuting Christians or who won't allow Jewish Christians to be a part of their community. And so maybe it's that we have a Jewish Christian business owner who has found that his new faith, while he loves the blessings of God in it, he notices that his old clients won't come to him anymore. Maybe his own family members don't speak to him anymore. Now he's not welcomed in the synagogue that he's gone to his entire life anymore. And he's looking up and saying, you know what? I can still believe this stuff, but kind of do it in secret, right? And kind of go back to my old ways, that kind of thing. In fact, I wouldn't doubt that there are those who rejected Jesus as the Messiah who were publicly advocating against Jesus as the Messiah. And so you had some Jewish opponents who are arguing, don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and trying to recruit people back, if you will. So if that's the case, Hebrews makes a lot of sense because there are warnings about drifting and warnings about going back. We don't have time to look at all those texts, but just to point out that it's clear that there's a concern for those who are going to somehow think that the law of Moses is a better option than the law of Jesus, if you will. But also, it could be the case that it's written to Gentile Christians who are fascinated with Judaism. And I see this all the time, and I can even say it about myself. At some point in your Christian faith, you start to learn that we have so many historic ties with Judaism. I mean, first of all, we both accept what we call the Old Testament as Scripture, right, from God. We believe in the same God. We believe He did all those things that the Old Testament says. We believe that the New Testament is very dependent upon the Old Testament. Quotes it hundreds of times. And we see that we've got this heritage. We think it's cool that there's this place called the Holy Land where all this biblical history took place. And the Jews can claim it as their history, but we want to claim it as our history too. And then we find out that there are certain Jewish traditions that are also repeated in the New Testament, and you kind of become very interested in that. I think that's a good, healthy thing. But it also could become the fact that, and you do see this with some Christians, is they become so fascinated with Judaism that they somehow try to bring Judaism into the church and actually want Gentile Christians to start doing what I might call Jewish things. And try to bind some laws on them. That really does happen. Now, I'm not saying that happens in Joe Shulam's church. I'm not saying that happens in North Boulevard. But I am saying that in the greater Christian world, sometimes that happens. There's some crazy teachings out there. And one of the things, if you read Christian history, is there was a constant struggle by Christian leaders to try to keep Gentile Christians from going to synagogues. Now, rightly or wrongly, they would really say some very cruel things about Jews, but it was clear they did not want Christians to be enticed to leave their faith, Gentile Christians, and go become proselyte Jews. And so maybe some of that's going on in the book of Hebrews as well. And I'd say probably a little bit of both, but you don't really necessarily have to pick. It's clear that it's aimed at those with a great interest in Judaism. That's kind of where I'll leave it. Just to cover the first 4 verses and show why that would be, you would say something like this to a person who is very interested in Judaism but had already committed to Jesus as Lord. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom also He made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. After He provided purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the majesty of God. So He became as much superior to the angels as the name He has inherited is superior to theirs. So you might have noticed in the title slide, what I suggested is that Hebrews is about the fact that Jesus is better. And one of the comparisons he makes is that Jesus is better than angels. He's superior to angels. And what he's saying is a couple of things. In first century Judaism, it's clear that a lot of people were really fascinated with angels. Paul mentions that some were caught up in the worship of angels. And so it's important to say that Jesus, you listen to Jesus over angels. But it's also important to note that the law of Moses was given by angels. Okay, that's the New Testament tradition. It says the law of Moses was handed down by angels. And so he starts off and he says, in the past, God spoke to prophets at many times and in various ways. You can read all about that in your Old Testament. But he's even spoken more clearly than your Old Testament. And that is through his son, Jesus. Okay? So he's saying now, if you want to know about God, sure, your Old Testament is good, but if you want to get it absolutely from God's mouth, go to God's Word, the Son, because he's the exact representation of his being. Okay? So a comparison is being made. You can see that in chapter 2. He says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels, that's the law, was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? So if Jesus is greater than angels, angels pass down the law, what's going to happen to us? You know the punishments that came if you disobeyed the law. What if you ignored the salvation of Jesus? In Hebrews 3:3, he says, Jesus has been found worthy of a greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. And then he even goes on to say that the covenant that God made with Israel, God's going to come up with a new one. He's got a new one, and he says, verse 13, by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. So this new covenant is better than the old covenant. Okay, because it's not just a promise to the people of Israel, it's a promise to everyone. So there's a comparison going on here. He's never going to say anything bad about the law of Moses. He's not going to say that it was flawed. He does actually say the flaw was in the people, not with the law. But what he wants us to understand is the law of Moses, while good, doesn't offer the salvation that Jesus does. So it's clear that the book is written to those with an interest in Judaism who might be tempted in some way to hold on to the Judaism part but lose the Jesus part. And he wants them to make sure, whatever you do, don't let go of Jesus. That answers the who question. Who wrote it? We don't know. Maybe Paul, maybe not. And to whom was it written? Those with an interest in Judaism. Now, when was it written? I'll go through this one pretty quickly. Probably in the second half of the first century A.D. Now, the reason we'd say that is for several reasons. First of all, when we're talking about the dates, remember, I already said it's clear that Clement was familiar with the book of Hebrews. So if he died, usually it's dated around A.D. 96 when he died. So if he died in 96, it had to be written before then, and enough before then for Clement to know about it. So a few years before then probably. But even more than that, you've got reference to Timothy, someone who knows Timothy and travels with Timothy. So assuming Timothy didn't live to be 180 years old, then it's going to have to be somewhere there in the second half of the first century. So I think second half of first century is probably about as good as I can do. Where was it written? Obviously, we're going out further on a limb each time because if I don't know who the author was and I don't know for sure the recipients were, then it's going to be hard to say a when and specifically a where. But there's one place that comes up a lot when you read the commentaries, and that is Alexandria, Egypt. And let me tell you why that is. Number one, there was a very large Jewish community in Alexandria in the first century. And so even before the time of Jesus, there were already many, many Jews in Alexandria. Second of all, Alexandria was a Greek-speaking city. Third of all, Alexandria was a great center of learning, both in Judaism and then later in Christianity, so that some of the most important writers we have from the first, second, third century are from the city of Alexandria. So on the Jewish side, you have Philo of Alexandria. On the Christian side, you have Clement of Alexandria. Remember we talked about him a moment ago. And in this Alexandrian school, it's clear that they took some of the best of Greek thought and tried to merge it with some of the best of biblical thought. Sometimes they did that well, sometimes they didn't do it too well. And so it kind of makes sense that if you got someone who's very well educated and writing in very polished Greek, who knows a lot about Judaism and seems to be a Jew himself, and then, and this is the part that might surprise you a little bit, clearly borrows from some Greek ideas, and I'll show you later in the class how some of Platonic thoughts, so Plato's thoughts, are echoed in Hebrews. That kind of influence, Alexandria makes sense, but it's all just a guess, okay? Because you have a place where you have educated Jews, educated Christians, writing, comparing Greek and Jewish thought or Greek and Christian thought. So Alexandria makes sense, but it's just a guess. If it's Alexandria, then some people like to say Apollos is the author, because that's where Apollos is originally from. And he was an important figure in the New Testament church. So maybe. As far as I know, no ancient author suggests Apollos. Martin Luther suggested that it was Apollos. And again, several others have suggested that since then. So I'm not going back to authorship. I'm just saying where it might be Alexandria. So I know that's real helpful because I've told you I don't know for sure who wrote it. I don't know exactly when it was written, and I don't know where it was written. I could have cut through that a lot faster. However, the most important thing to note is the what. The what and the why, I should say. What is Hebrews? Well, Hebrews is an odd document for the New Testament because, again, it doesn't have an introduction. Paul doesn't introduce himself. Nobody does that. It just launches straight into its arguments. Remember that. God, who in times past spoke through the prophets, that's the way it begins. There's no greeting. But there is a salutation. There is a formal ending to it. And so if you look at chapter 13, all of a sudden it reads like a letter that's ending. And it seems more like something Paul might have written because of that. But there is a clue that's given to us in Hebrews 13:22. He says, "Brothers and sisters, I urge you to bear with my word of exhortation, for in fact I have written to you quite briefly." First of all, this thing is 13 chapters long, and it's going to take us a while to get through it, and he thinks he wrote to them briefly. All right? I'd hate to see what he thought of as at length. But there's a clue here in this term here, the word of exhortation. It indicates what he thinks he's doing. He's exhorting these people, but that also, the term that's used there in the original language can have a more of a formal sense to it. You see that in Acts 13:15. It says, when Paul and some others go to a synagogue, after the reading from the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them saying, "Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak." So the way we might say it is this. It's a sermon. The brothers, if you have a sermon, offer it. It's a word of exhortation, and so what I would call it maybe is a way to think of it as a sermon of encouragement. So what Hebrews is a sermon of encouragement with an epistolary ending, with a letter-type ending. And so it could literally be that the author of Hebrews preached this long sermon aimed at those interested in Judaism, and then said, hey, this sermon is good enough to print. And I'm going to add now a formal ending to it, and then I'm going to send it. Maybe to several churches. I don't know. But I do think it's not going too far to say Hebrews is a sermon of encouragement with an epistolary ending, which is why it doesn't read like a normal letter at the beginning. It's also well constructed. So it wouldn't just be an off-the-cuff kind of sermon, but it's one that shows a great deal of forethought, a great deal of design in its language and its argument and its rhetoric, that kind of thing. And then lastly, why? Well, I've kind of already said all this, but it leads up to what we're getting to this. The appeal of Judaism was strong. It had an older heritage with interesting and intricate traditions. Perhaps because of pressure from non-believing Jews and Romans, the appeal to leave Jesus or to disguise one's faith in Jesus was great. So just very briefly go through this. If you've been in my classes much, I hate to draw this huge distinction between Judaism and Christianity. Because again, it's not like Christianity is a new religion. in many senses, we're a part of Israel, right? I don't like to draw this firm line, but sometimes it needed to be, especially in the context of Hebrews, where you have people who seem to be literally considering leaving Jesus, so maybe some have already done that, to make their lives easier. And in that sense, we have to use pretty strong language. And so you can see if you're a Gentile Christian, hey, you're part of this new exciting movement, but you don't have the old traditions that the Jews do, right? The old stories and everything. You can talk about those stories, but they're the Jews' stories first. And so they've got all these interesting traditions that they have, and you can see the appeal there. And then you've got pressure from the outside. See, the Romans didn't always love the Jews. In fact, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Roman world long before the time of Jesus. But they did respect them as a religion because it was an old religion, and they kind of let them have their way. They didn't, for most of the time, they didn't make the Jews pay the taxes to go to the various temples for the gods. They let them pay for their own temple because they said, okay, it's an old religion. You're grandfathered in, if you will. But Christians didn't necessarily have that going for them. A lot of Romans would have looked up and said, hey, what's this new thing? It's weird. And then a lot of Jews who rejected Jesus would say the same thing. Yeah, what's this new thing? It's weird. So there'd be a lot of pressure to give in to the more traditional, whether it be Jewish or Roman. And there might be some indication of that, and we'll close by reading from Hebrews 12. He says in verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. So stop there for a second. So he seemed to indicate that whatever kind of pressure or what kind of persecution isn't so that they're physically being martyred or beaten or anything like that, but they're certainly being twisted and turned, and it's hard for them. And he says in verse 5, have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement? Notice that word of encouragement. That's the same word of exhortation we looked to a moment ago, that addresses you as a father addresses his son. It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. So, how do you handle this? Well, we might consider light persecution compared to martyrdom and that kind of thing, but it's still real. How do you handle it? Well, look at it as discipline from God. Don't ask, why is this happening? It's clear it's happening because God is disciplining you. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, you're not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we've all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respect them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. So I think this indicates they're facing pressure, and that pressure might make Judaism without Jesus an appealing thing. And so we'll see as we go throughout the letter that he's constantly warning them, don't give in to this. He'll make this statement in chapter 6. We'll spend a lot of time on this, that it's impossible for those who have once been enlightened, who've been tasted the heavenly gift, the people who have accepted Jesus as their Lord, if they fall away, to be renewed again to repentance. He'll say it's impossible for them to be renewed to repentance. Wow. Okay. Well, with 30 seconds left, I'm not going to solve that one. But the point being, he's saying there's a big danger here. You're walking towards a fine line from which you can't come back. All right? So if the appeal to get away from that persecution is to do Judaism without Jesus, there's not a lot of hope for you if you do that. That's what he says. And I think that indicates a couple of things. There was great pressure, so that you had Christians who were tempted to leave Jesus, but also that they could take that pressure and say, no, this is God's evidence of his love for us, because he's helping us grow. He's disciplining us, just like our fathers did. That's the teaching of Hebrews. I look forward to going through this letter with you in 9 weeks. You're dismissed.